Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tudors episode 117 and the second instalment of the All Things Tudor Queens and Consorts series. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger, and I'm so glad that you could join me. As always, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the wonderful listeners who continue to support this podcast via Podbean Patron, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. This really does make a difference. If you love the podcast and tune into every episode, perhaps you'd consider becoming a Talking Tudors patron. Just click on the Be My Patron on Podbean badge on the homepage of my website, www.onthetudortrail.com. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll be automatically entered into our patron-only monthly giveaways. July's prize is an amazing Tudor book bundle, which includes the following titles: Forgotten Queens in Medieval and Early Modern Europe, edited by Dr. Valerie Schutte and Dr. Estelle Perronque; Mary I and the Art of Book Dedications by Dr. Valerie Schutte; and Dr. Schutte's latest book, Princess Mary and Elizabeth Tudor and the Gift Book Exchange. A huge thank you to Dr. Schutte for sponsoring this fantastic prize. Now, on to today's episode. I'm excited that joining me on the show to talk about Portraiture of the Six Wives of Henry VIII is Roland Hui. Roland graduated from Concordia University in Canada with a BA degree in art history. He's the author of The Turbulent Crown, The Story of the Tudor Queens, and the co-creator of the Mary Queen of Scots colouring book. Roland's research interests include Tudor portraiture, and his Tudor-related hobbies include miniature portrait painting and making illuminated manuscripts. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Roland. How are you?
Good evening, where I am, and good morning to you, I believe.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Now, let's start by you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about your background.
Well, my name is Roland Hui, and I graduated from art history at Concordia University in Canada. And then after that, I went to work in interpretive media with the National Park Service, California State Parks, and the U.S. Forest Service. So now I currently work as a writer of Tudor Society.
And what actually sparked your interest in the fascinating Tudors?
Well, I've always been interested in history, but I have to say, particularly with the Tudors, it was one photograph. So when I was about 6 or 7, my parents took our family to London, England for a holiday. So we went to all the places, the Tower of London, Buckingham Palace, particularly Madame Tussauds, which I don't really remember except the horrible Chamber of Horrors. My parents picked up the program brochure, and we went back home afterwards. And later on, when I was about, I'd say 12 or 13, I came across the brochure, and inside they had a picture of Henry VIII and his six wives. And I was just fascinated by that one particular picture. This big man with all the jewels and the brocade and everything like that, surrounded by these six women. Who are they? So I started looking them up, in the encyclopedia and in books that my high school, actually, I was grateful that we had a good range of Tudor books, actually. And I just became fascinated by that afterwards. So thanks to that one photo, I would say.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Normally people have a book or a movie, so that's a really interesting take. So, Roland, you're the author of The Turbulent Crown, the story of the Tudor queens, and you're also the co-creator of the Mary Queen of Scots colouring book. So can you just tell us briefly about these titles?
The coloring book is a collaboration with a very talented artist named Dmitry Yevkovsky. He did the illustrations while I wrote the text. The Turbulent Crown book is a book I wrote in 2017, and it's about the lives of the Tudor queens, the Queen Consorts and the Queen Regnants, meaning the six wives of Henry VIII as a consorts, and Elizabeth of York, and the Queen Regnants being, of course, Queen Mary, even Queen Jane, and Queen Elizabeth. So it's kind of like the book ends with Elizabeth of York and then ends with Elizabeth I. And I kind of think of it as a modern Agnes Strickland's Lives of the Queens of England, if you put it that way.
Now, today we're going to focus on one of your main research interests at the moment, and that's Tudor portraiture of the six queen consorts of Henry VIII. So before we dive into this really interesting topic, what makes this subject fascinating for you?
I think when you read about these fascinating people, you want to know what they look like. So imagine we read about Henry VIII, but for some reason, no portraits exist of Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth I or anybody who is a great figure in history. And that leaves a big gap in we want to know what these people look like, because that helps in our understanding of them, I think. So I think it's it's great to look into that. And also, to me, portraiture is fascinating because in terms of Tudor portraiture, sometimes it's a fun guessing game and detective game about trying to find out who this person really is or this person who is really not. And one of the portraits I found recently was a image of Anne Boleyn, actually, in the Black Book of the Garter, which has not been noticed for actually 155 years. It was actually mentioned in a footnote in a journal called Archaeologia a long time ago, in one sentence in a commentary about another article. So I came across this and I looked up the image, which is actually online. I mean, everyone can see it. It's been online for a while. But the person who wrote the article, George Scharf, the director of the National Portrait Gallery back in the Victorian era, mentioned that it was Anne Boleyn because the sitter had an AB pendant from her neck. So I looked it up, and indeed so. So I like to think I brought this back into the public consciousness, and people can agree whether it's her or not. But I do think it's a very strong case of another contemporary portrait of Anne, because it was done in 1534 and by Lucas Hornbout, who did other portraits of the Tudor court at that time.
Yeah, fantastic. As you're talking, I'm actually picturing the portrait because I do know it well. I agree with you. It seems highly likely that it is Anne. So Catherine of Aragon was Henry VIII's first wife, of course. The couple married in June 1509 and remained together for more than 2 decades. Now, a portrait that we often see in connection with Catherine is one by Miquel Setau. However, the identification of the sitter is in fact hotly debated, and people get into lots of discussions about this. So can you talk to us about this particular portrait and its various kind of re-identifications that it's had?
Oh, certainly. I've assumed, and many people have assumed, that it's a picture of Catherine of Aragon as a young woman, as a girl, actually. But in 2008, there was a art historian named Paul Matthews who suggested otherwise. He thinks that it's Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. And he had a whole bunch of arguments for his believing why, including that he thought Setau was not in England during Henry VII's reign, so he could not have painted Catherine when she was in England. He says there's no resemblance to Catherine in terms of comparison to other pictures. As well, her jewelry, he thought, might be significant because the K's and the C's did not denote Catherine with a K in English, or Catalina with C as it will be written in her native Spain, but rather Charles V, the future emperor. So Charles or Carolus with a K. And because there were examples, I think he said that one of Charles's sisters had jewelry that was similar with C's and K's, that there was an imperial connection to the Habsburgs rather than a Spanish family with Catherine. And interestingly, the Kunsthistorische, which is hard to pronounce, museum who owns a picture, has actually accepted Matthew's argument. So if you go there, and I think the website will have this too, it is called Mary Tudor, not Catherine of Aragon.
It's a beautiful portrait. Whoever the sitter is, it is just a stunning portrait. Just the pose of the sitter. It's quite contemplative, and I really love it. I kind of hope that it was Catherine, because I think it's such a beautiful portrait. But I can see,
I'm inclined to think it's Catherine as well, because there are a set of pictures of her sisters. Juana, Maria, I think, the other daughters of Ferdinand, Isabella, and they all look alike.
They really do. That's
so
true. Yeah, there is definitely a resemblance.
Catherine / Mary looks like one of the sitters. And I think the K, the necklace with the K, says Catherine, and it has little red and white roses. So a reference to her being the person that unifies the houses of Lancaster, York, because she will be married to Prince Arthur, who will have the heir to carry on the Tudor dynasty. Yeah. So I think there's a good argument for Catherine, but I think it's most likely Catherine.
Fantastic. And for our listeners, I'll post these portraits after our episode goes live so that everyone can have a look and decide for themselves what they think. So what about other contemporary portraits of Catherine? What do we have?
There are actually a lot, because she was queen for about 20 years. So we have stained glass of her. There are miniatures by Lucas Hornbaugh. There's about at least 2 or 3. There's one with her wearing the red dress and a small golden cap, which is very familiar. People have seen that. Of course, the one with her with a little monkey.
Yes,
that's a very popular
monkey,
picture.
Yes.
So people have seen that. And it's a close-up of the standard image of her with the gable hood. Recently, there was one identified as Catherine, used to be called Catherine Parr. She's wearing red and gold. The National Portrait Gallery has it, I believe, and there's a copy at Hever Castle. So it's been matched to that portrait of a younger Henry VIII. They're kind of looking at each other when you put them together. So now it's believed to be Catherine, which is, I think, very sound, because if it was Catherine Parr, the costume was just too early for Catherine Parr. It's a gable hood with a very long lappets. The hanging part.
Much earlier.
So that would be the time of Catherine in 1520. So I think it's Catherine of Aragon.
Fantastic. Like you say, it is a bit of detective work, isn't it? Trying to piece together the costume and any other kind of provenance information.
It's great fun, though. It is really great fun, because you have to look through other portraits, look through inventories, hopefully to find jewelry lists. And oh yes, that's the jewel that's described in this portrait. Which we'll talk about after. I mean, how interesting is that to match that with a sitter wearing what seems to be that particular jewel?
Yeah, I love it. It's what makes it so addictive, this research, I think. Now, Anne Boleyn's appearance has been the topic of course, many discussions and papers and books and anything you can think of, really. Unfortunately, the only contemporary likeness of Henry VIII's second queen consort is a small portrait medal, probably struck in 1534 when she was expecting the couple's second child. Can you tell us about this incredible artifact?
Yes, it's a medal. I have one here. It's about, I would say, 2 inches across, made of lead, struck in 1534, and it's believed to have been made to celebrate Anne's upcoming pregnancy. So she was pregnant at the time, apparently, and it was made to celebrate the future heir, the upcoming heir. It has her motto, the most happy, the most fortunate. That's how it translates.
Exactly,
really. Yeah. Unfortunately, because it's soft lead, it's been damaged. So Lucy Churchill, who was made a reconstruction of it, a wonderful, beautiful reconstruction. Her thought was that it wasn't actually deliberately damaged, as a lot of people think, that, oh, we don't like Anne Boleyn and she's no longer queen, so it'll destroy this or mar this medal. But apparently, her thought is that it was just simply put away, and maybe some books or something heavy was stacked on top of it, and it just got damaged that way. That's why the nose is flattened and the forehead as well.
Yeah, I actually own I own the same reconstruction that you do. I absolutely love it. It sits on my desk. I'm looking at it right now as I talk to you. And it's quite a magnificent reconstruction, isn't it? I think Lucy's done a stellar job. And she was there, studying the original medal for
I
a
mean,
very long time.
how
Yeah.
lucky she
Oh,
was doing that. I love the medal. I
absolutely.
have one too, of course, and I have the bigger plaque and actually the small silver pendant as well.
Yes,
So
I actually
kudos
have the
to
pendant too.
Churchill for recreating this, a beautiful item.
It is absolutely stunning. Now, when we think of Anne today, of course, I'm sure that many people immediately picture the portrait of Anne that's housed at the National Portrait Gallery in London, the one where she's wearing her famous bee necklace. So, what can you tell us about this particular work and that pattern that was obviously copied a number of times?
Oh, one thing I would mention about the medal before we go on to this,
Sure.
she's wearing an English gabled hood, which is interesting because there's a lot of people say, oh, it's very odd. It's not her because Anne is always wearing a French hood. She never wore a gabled hood, which is not true, of course. When Anne wanted to present herself officially on this medal, she chose to wear an English hood.
Yes, I think that's a really important point to make. And also the fact that she went to her death wearing an English
Yes,
hood.
she
Yeah.
wore a hood of English make, I think the actual quote is.
Yeah. So I
So
think that's interesting.
so Anne wearing, I think the misconceptions that we always think of Anne with the famous bee portrait, hence the pearled French rounded hood. About the bee type necklace, which is interesting. I'm glad you referred to it as the B type because for a long time it was called the NPG National Portrait
Right.
Gallery type. But over the years, there have been so many copies and variants of this portrait that have popped up. There are at least about a dozen or so. So it's not exclusively the NPGs anymore. So it is the most famous picture of Anne, but it was actually not in the public consciousness until the late 1800s, I believe. Before that, it was always another picture of Anne, which we'll talk about after. She's wearing a gabled hood, and it's from a drawing by Holbein. So for the longest time, that image was associated with Anne Boleyn until I think probably because when the National Portrait Gallery acquired the portrait of the B type, so to speak, in the late 1800s, people got to see that. It got disseminated. So hence the shift went from the Holbein to the B type portrait as the official image of Anne.
And it's a wonderful portrait. Again, I've got that sitting next to the medal on my desk, so I look at both of them to compare.
Don't we all?
Now let's talk for a moment about Jane Seymour. So her reign was even more brief, unfortunately, than her predecessors. So, however, a portrait of the Queen by Hans Holbein the Younger actually survives. Very lucky for Jane. So can you describe it for us?
It's based on a sketch of Jane, a black and white drawing of Jane. Jane is wearing red, a gabled hood, and there were, from this pattern, many were reproduced. So we have a lot of copies of this, and Jane would be wearing different jewels, different jewelry. There's even one of her wearing black in that outfit in Ripon Cathedral in New York, which is interesting. Going back to the Anne Boleyn portrait, if you don't mind, about the bee portrait. Unfortunately, the majority, or probably all of them, are Elizabethan copies. We don't know whether any of them, because they have not been tested, whether they're actually done during her lifetime, but because of the quality, the center looks very flat. She doesn't look particularly lively or lifelike. They're just mediocre copies made during the time of Elizabeth, and these were for what they called long galleries back then. So the elite had these houses, and they would have long galleries, and the long galleries would be decorated with portraits of kings and queens. And the Anne Boleyn type of the bee necklace are I would say almost all of them were made to accompany a Henry VIII painting. So that's why you always have the inscription Anne Boleyn, wife of Henry VIII. It's in that context. So they were never made to stand alone. They were always in context with the king. So the portraits of Jane, which we have a few as well that were like, Jane Seymour in Latin, the wife of Henry VIII. So they were as well created in that context as long gallery pictures.
I still hold hope, Roland, that we'll find a contemporary portrait hidden in some stately home of Anne at some point. That would be really amazing. I was actually lucky enough to be invited to see the National Portrait Gallery portrait when it was in conservation in Chelsea a number of years ago. And it was, I can tell you, an amazing experience to see it out of the frame, just sitting there in front of me, able to look at the back of the portrait and the front. That was, in the end, concluded that it was early 17th century, I believe that one. So around about 1600 or something like that. So yeah, a beautiful portrait, amazing.
Now, did you know that portrait in the 1970s or late 60s has a big crack in the center that's very, very visible? And they fixed it so well that it's almost invisible now.
It's incredible what they can do. I totally agree with you. It was in desperate need of conservation a number of years back again. So obviously it's something they need to maintain every so often, but they do incredible work now. That's for sure.
There are other Anne Boleyn portraits. Would you like to get into that too?
Yeah, sure.
There's a whole bunch of those. There are 2 drawings by Holbein. A very famous one is the one I've talked about before, which was in very high circulation as Anne Boleyn from 1649. So the earliest copy dated from an engraving by Wenceslas Haller, 1649. So whether it is Anne or not, we really don't know, because the earliest mention is 1649. I mean, that's 15 odd years after she died. But it was a very popular image, and it was accepted as Anne Boleyn until the more popular B image was brought into the public sphere. And as well, the Holbein portrait of Anna Boleyn, and you might know which one I'm talking about. It's a lady with a very thick chin. She's a pronounced double chin, very plainly dressed, looking to the left. So that has been very controversial. It has been around. It was identified by a gentleman called John Cheek, who was a tutor to Edward VI in the 1550s. So based on that, people thought, well, there's a good chance it was Anne Boleyn, but it was never widely accepted in the public consciousness until 1983. David Starkey and an art historian named John Rowlands, together they wrote an article saying that Cheek was actually correct in saying that the picture was Anne Boleyn. So they re-identified it as her based on a number of things that Cheek was correct. She had a swollen chin because Anne apparently had a swollen chin at her coronation. She had a high ruff around her neck because she had to conceal a goiter.
Oh, yes. I think that's one of those very hostile accounts of the Queen.
Definitely. Yeah. So that was one of the reasons why. And another was that, she's in a state of undress. That's how they put it. So, but because she was queen, she was one of the rare people who were allowed to be shown like this, which I found kind of odd, because I wouldn't say that's a state of undress, really. Yeah, and
of course there's the portrait of Henry. I think it's Henry Fitzroy that's wearing a similar.
Yes, exactly.
Similar thing.
He has a nightcap on, and he has his laces undone on his shirt, and that's very. So I think they take that argument that royalty is they were allowed to take such liberties, and also there was the suggestion that Anne Boleyn had a very immoral and loose court. Hence, she was allowed to be undressed, but she's really not undressed in this picture, I find.
Yeah, it's a fascinating portrait. I actually quite like that one, and I feel quite drawn to that particular portrait that you've described. So hopefully we'll see that more work needs to be done, I think, on that, definitely.
Yeah. But there are a number of arguments against that, though.
Yes, there are, of course.
Yeah.
The hair color, I think, is probably one of the ones I've seen more often, although not everyone agrees that that's hair that we're seeing. So it's a very controversial picture, isn't it?
Because I think a lot of people have worked from the portrait from a black and white copy of the picture. They have not seen in color. And if you look at it, I believe it's hair. It looks like she's blonde. So I think that's a very strong argument that it's not Anne Boleyn, who was very famously dark-haired.
Just touching back on Jane again for a moment. Yeah. So apart from the Holbein portrait, do we have any other contemporary portraits of Jane Seymour?
There are a bunch as well, because even though she was only queen for about a year and a half or so, she died in 1537 October when she gave birth to Prince Edward. Because she was supposedly Henry VIII's favorite wife, and factually she was Edward VI's mother, her memory was perpetuated. So we do have the very famous Whitehall mural, now lost. It was lost in the fire. But luckily, paintings were made of this particular picture, and it shows Jane on one side with Elizabeth of York facing Henry VIII and Henry VII.
Yeah, that's a really interesting painting. And I would have loved to have seen the original on the wall in Whitehall Palace. So it's, by the sounds of it, though, they're made after Jane's death. So we've got the Holbein, which we believe was made during her reign, and then other portraits that were made to keep her memory alive, as you say. Yep.
Yes. So there's another picture of her with Henry VIII and with Prince Edward and with the two princesses at Hampton Court. Yes. That's a beautiful painting. So again, that's Jane's memory being kept alive. And interestingly, the queen at that time was Catherine Parr. So maybe Catherine Parr wasn't very happy about, this Jane Seymour again, and why am I not in this painting?
Yeah, poor Catherine. That's true. Now, following the death of his beloved third wife, Jane Seymour, the king, of course, married Anne of Cleves, who was 24 years old at the time, a good deal younger than her 48-year-old Henry VIII. So tell us about Holbein's portrait. I'm sure everyone listening has heard about the Holbein portrait of Anne that so enticed the king.
Yeah, so after he got rejected very famously by Christina of Denmark, we all know the story there. She said, I would rather, if I had two heads, I would give one to Henry VIII, or I suspect that my great aunt, Catherine of Aragon, was poisoned and Anne Boleyn was innocently put to death. And the third one died because of giving birth. So she was not happy to be matched with Henry VIII. So he had to go look elsewhere. So they came upon the German court of Cleves, upon the daughters of Duke John of Cleves, Anne and Amelia. So they were at the court of Durham, and Holbein was sent to paint their picture, because a picture that was sent of Anne to England was not considered acceptable, because they thought that it didn't really show her well, and she was covered up with all her very big Germanic costume. So Holbein was sent to the court of Durham to paint her again. He did a panel portrait and a miniature. Both were said to be very lifelike, very good likenesses. And she looks very attractive in the picture. But when Henry VIII saw her in person, so he did accept her as his wife after seeing the pictures, so he liked the pictures. But when they met on New Year's Day at Rochester, things did not go well for some reason, which remains very, very mysterious. He just did not like her. Seeing her in the flesh was different than seeing her in painting.
Yes, I must say, I think that has to do with Henry's wounded ego after she failed to recognize one of his famous dress-ups that the king loved to dress up and surprise people. Poor Anne didn't realize it was the king. Oh, dear. To be a fly on the wall that day, hey? Now,
yes, there's a famous story about that. He even brought a gift for her, and then he was so upset, it was said that he never gave her the furs. He just left.
Now, in July 1540, this is like the Bold and the Beautiful Henry VIII story, isn't it? Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, of course. Mm-hmm. Like her cousin Anne, she ended her reign on the scaffold. Now, Catherine's associated with a number of portraits, in particular one after Hans Holbein the Younger. However, the sitter is now believed to be a member of the Cromwell family. So do any contemporary portraits of Catherine actually survive?
I'm inclined to think so. We would like to think so, because wouldn't it be awful if we don't have a picture of Catherine Howard? So the one that comes to mind are two miniatures by Holbein in the Buccleuch collection and the Royal collection, of a young woman, very richly dressed with furred sleeves. And about 1540, 1541, I think we all know which one we're talking about. That has generally been accepted as Catherine. Though, I have to say, this was not the case until the 18th century, when it was first called Catherine. And when it was engraved by Wenceslas Haller in the 1600s, one version of it was called Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. Goodness. So we do think it's Catherine. The argument now is for her jewelry. One of the pieces of jewelry that she wears is a pendant with a ruby, an emerald, and a hanging pearl. That seems to be a specific jewelry. It's called an ouche or a flower, which means it's a brooch really, that is in Catherine's jewelry list done in 1541. So if that is the same, it's a good chance that it is. And what it comes down to is we really hope and like it to be Catherine Howard. There's no 100%. So if I was to mention this, I like to put in brackets a little question mark. And about that panel portrait of the Cromwell family, it was thought to be Catherine in the late 1800s because the art historian Lionel Cust thought the sitter looked like the woman in the two Holbein miniatures, the Buccleuch one and the Royal Collection one. So based on that, he thought it was Catherine Howard. Nowadays, we think it's probably, perhaps, who knows, a member of the Cromwell family, probably Elizabeth Seymour, Jane's sister, because she was married to Thomas Cromwell's son, Gregory. So being a prominent Seymour / Cromwell, there's a good chance it's her. And we don't know. Recently, there was an exhibition by the Philip Mould Gallery. It was called Lost Faces, the rediscovery of the Tudors. And they have brought back this portrait, and they argue it's her, but we're not sure, based on what they think it's a resemblance, again, between the small miniatures and the larger panel pieces.
Now, the National Portrait Gallery, we've mentioned it a few times. It's, of course, a treasure trove of Tudor portraits, and it's home to one by a Master John from circa around 1545, which for a time was thought to depict Lady Jane Grey, but as these things go, the sitter is now believed to be Catherine Parr. So what evidence is there to support this new identification? And Roland, do you agree with it?
Yes, I do. Because actually, for a very long time, the portrait was accepted as Catherine Parr. For a very long time, until 1965, actually, when Roy Strong, the director of the National Portrait Gallery, they acquired that large Master John painting. And he matched that painting to a engraving by Magdalena de Pas and Simon de Pas, done in about 1620. Which shows the same sitter with the same costume, and particularly with a brooch with a crown on it. But it was inscribed the Lady Jane Grey. Right. So because of this one engraving, Roy Strong thought, oh, it's actually not Catherine Parr, it's the Lady Jane Grey. And then moving forward to, I think it was 1996, a historian named Susan James wrote an article. No, it's not Jane Grey, it's Catherine Parr, based on, again, the crown brooch. She went through Catherine's jewelry list, her inventory, and she found a mention of the jewel, which I'll actually read to you here. It was described as one ouche or flower, meaning a brooch, with a crown containing 2 diamonds, 1 ruby, 1 emerald, the crown being garnished with diamonds and 3 pearl pendants. So which is a match for the Master John sitter's pendant. So it is Catherine Parr after all.
Fantastic. I love that. I love that detective work. It's a reason why I love inventories. I'm obsessed with inventories for that particular reason.
Now people are looking into that. I don't think that people have actually looked into jewelry lists. So people are now looking at Catherine jewelry's list, and hopefully, if there was one found Anne Boleyn, we could look
That's
at
right.
that up. Yeah.
So true. All right. So when it comes to the portraiture of Henry VIII's Queen Consorts, what do you think is one of the most prevalent misconceptions? There's probably quite a few, but what do you think is one of the most prevalent ones?
I would say the biggest misconception is that when we come across pictures of unknown sitters, people automatically assume it's someone famous. And there have been cases, especially online. It's very easy to find something online and people just jump on it. Recently on Instagram, some of you might know, a portrait of a lady wearing red popped up, and the person who was championing this, he says it's Anne Boleyn. But there's actually no reason to believe it's her. Recently, there was a portrait of a young girl at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that's being called Catherine Howard these days. And it has been used on some book covers and in some books about Catherine. And honestly, there's actually no reason to associate her with Catherine other than what her age looks right and the date looks right. But, honestly, it could be any high-ranking young woman of the time. And we would love it to be Catherine. There's a vacuum there, but we need the proof about that, and I think it's lacking. So that's the biggest misconception to me, that unknown sitter has to be someone famous and probably a queen or a princess. And there's that portrait, there's a Yale miniature at the Yale Center of British Art of a young woman that's been called Elizabeth. It's been called Jane Grey. It's been called Mary Tudor, the queen. And it's that, and she might simply be unknown woman, and she might just stay that way.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's evidence of our insatiable appetite for the Tudors and our desperate need to make some sort of personal connection with them through portraiture, which, of course, as you say, is so important because we can make that connection when we see a portrait of a person. But sometimes, yes, I think we jump to conclusions a little too quickly.
Exactly. Like the Anne Boleyn portrait, where we all want to find that lost portrait. I mean, did Holbein paint her? Wouldn't it be an assumption that he did, because he did work for her? He did designs for jewelry for her. He designed that famous arch for her coronation. So there was a close association of Holbein with the court at that time. So one would assume that he painted her, but what happened to it? Where is it? Maybe he didn't paint her? And
yeah, I would be very surprised if he didn't paint a portrait of her.
Exactly.
I'd be very surprised, but I suppose we need the evidence, don't we? We need at least the account or the painting to turn up somewhere. Now, Roland, tell us about one of your favorite Tudor portraits.
It's not actually a painted portrait, but it's a portrait jewel. It's a checkers locket ring. Isn't that beautiful?
That's stunning.
We all love it. We all want it, and we all want to hold it and touch it. I was actually lucky enough to see it in person at the Elizabeth I exhibition at Greenwich years ago. It's tiny.
It was featured on that recent documentary with the lovely Tracy Borman.
Oh, yes.
She was holding it. You could tell how fragile and delicate it is.
It is. And there is actually controversy about that ring too.
Yes.
Because it has been suggested that it's not Anne Boleyn, but it's Elizabeth herself as a young woman, which I don't think so, because she wasn't a person to look back, I think. Especially during her younger years when her life was so full of danger. I mean, I don't think I would want to be reminded of that. And if the ring was done in about 1570, she was only in her early 40s. So there's really no reason to be so nostalgic as to look back to when I was a younger version of myself. And it's been proposed that it's Catherine Parr. But again, I don't see a sound explanation for this, because even though Catherine and Elizabeth were close when Catherine boarded Elizabeth after her father's death, and she lived with her and Thomas Seymour. After Catherine died, I mean, that was years and years ago, and I think the bond wasn't that, they were close that time, but for her to perpetuate Catherine's memory in a ring that's so intimate and personal, I don't see that.
Sorry, Roland, I was just going to say, for our listeners, in case they're unaware, this ring that we're discussing actually opens up to reveal two very tiny, tiny portraits, which is what we're saying. One is definitely Elizabeth. The other, I believe, to be Anne Boleyn, but other people, as Roland's explaining, think that it might be a younger Elizabeth or a Catherine Parr as well. So it is another controversial Tudor item, isn't it?
And actually, speaking about questionable identities, the very famous picture of Anne Boleyn with the bee pendant has not been 100% accepted by scholars. Susan James, who wrote about Catherine Parr and her re-identified that Catherine Parr, thinks it's Mary Tudor, actually Henry VIII's sister.
Oh goodness, that would throw a spanner in the works.
It does. I don't think many Anne fans are happy about what she said. So her reasoning is that the sitter looks a lot like Mary Tudor in her famous so-called marriage portrait with Charles Brandon.
Yes.
So she sees a connection. She sees a very strong likeness again. But that's very subjective, I think. When you say, "Oh, she looks like her and he looks like him," and that's a very personal opinion, I think. And again, and also she says B is for Brandon, not Boleyn. But yeah. I don't buy. I don't think anyone has bought into that. But there is that opinion out there still.
Now, Roland, I know that you actually have a number of Tudor-related hobbies yourself, including miniature portrait painting and making illuminated manuscripts. So I'd love to hear about the coronation books that you've worked on.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, one of my hobbies, my pastimes is painting miniatures. It's because I like art, I like drawing, I like painting, and I don't have access to these miniatures. Like I never have one. They're out of our reach. So why don't I'll make a copy and I'll be happy with that. So I took it a step further. I made a coronation book of Anne Boleyn, first of all. What I did was I took the text, the coronation text that was set down in a pamphlet from June 1533. So about 2 weeks after she was crowned, this pamphlet came out describing the propaganda, which it really was about her coronation, because she was not a popular queen. So it was basically all prose praising Anne and the wonderful things, the wonderful tableau, the wonderful presentations and speeches that were given in her honor. So there, I found a copy of it. The British Library has a copy of it in the original Old English. So I transcribed that onto vellum. So I work on calfskin vellum, which was the main support back then for miniatures, fancy manuscripts. And I added in some illustrations, and then had it nicely bound, and I had the cover stand with a white falcon, and it looks very authentically 16th century, I'm happy to say.
Yes.
And now I'm working on one for Queen Elizabeth I.
Fantastic. They're lovely items to have in your Tudor study. That provide inspiration for your writing. And the very last thing is a Tudor takeaway. So I ask all my guests for a suggestion for something for our listeners to watch or listen to or read after the episode. So do you have a Tudor takeaway for us?
My takeaway would be, not to sound geeky, but original primary sources. They are so fun to read, like letters and papers of Henry VIII and the calendars of dispatches from Spain, Vienna, and you could find them online. They were free, very easily accessible, and they were fun to read. Instead of just going to the secondary source, go to the horse's mouth, go to where it was first set down. And sometimes you find surprises too, like, because a lot of facts, I think, are repeated over time that were not actually facts, but they became facts over time. But you go to a primary source and you find, oh, really? That's what they said. They actually said back then, and it's been misinterpreted over time. And how interesting is that, to go back to the source? And I recommend this because they are easily accessible, free, and they are fun to read, at least to me.
Roland, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk Tudors with me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.